Anti-Semitism has been certainly a very dark part of Christian history through the centuries, which is, in a sense, ironic because Christianity began as a sect within Judaism. One person put it this way, that in the earliest days, Christianity was within Judaism, and through the centuries, probably from about the year 100 until the 20th century, Christianity and Judaism were over against each other. Now, I guess the challenge is to be with one another. The Second Vatican Council statement in a document called Nostra Aetate, the first two Latin words mean in our age, concerns the relationship of the Catholic Church to other religions. Paragraph number 4 concerns the relationship of the Catholic Church to Judaism. This was a very important statement. When Pope John the 23rd called the council in some 40 years ago, very high in his agenda was to make a statement about the relationship of the Church and Judaism. And this is what finally emerged. In that statement, there was an affirmation of the roots of Christianity within Judaism. There was an adoption of Paul's mature perspective on the relationship between Judaism and Christianity in Romans chapters 9 to 11. There was a refutation, if you will, of the charge of deicide, that is, that the Jews killed God. And there was an emphasis on the evils of anti-Semitism and how the church ought to resist any displays of anti-Semitism. Moreover, it emphasized that not all Jews at the time of Jesus, nor all Jews through the ages are responsible for the death of Jesus. Rather, it was a limited group of Jewish leaders in Jerusalem working in concert with Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. And in fact, the ultimate legal responsibility for the death of Jesus lay with the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. As a New Testament scholar, I've been interested from my earliest days in the Jewish world of the New Testament. In fact, my studies at Harvard were in post-exilic Judaism. That is, the writings from around 537 BC down to the rabbinic period. And I had to learn the languages and read the literature and do the archaeology and things of that nature. And my other interest, of course, through the years has been New Testament studies. And the book that tries to set the Synoptic Gospels free is a kind of a combination between those two great interests, trying to see how by placing the gospel text in their original historical context, we get a better understanding of Judaism and also a better understanding of Christianity. I think an uncritical reading of the Gospels takes them out of any historical context. They're read sometimes as if they were pieces of philosophy or pieces of abstract thinking, and they're anything but that. Rather, they are grounded in first century Judaism, and particularly in the Holy Land. And I think the more people get a sense of the historical context of these documents and at least try to sympathize with that historical context, the better they'll understand them, and also will at least blunt the force of anti-Judaism. An uncritical reading, when it hears the word the Jews in John's Gospel, for example, assumes they must also be talking about my next door neighbors or my friends who go to the synagogue, and they're saying all of these terrible things. Well, when you read John and when you read Matthew in their historical context, you see that they are speaking within Judaism and that they are themselves Jews and that they're engaged in a kind of historical struggle for who is the heir or the descendant of the Jewish heritage after the temple has been destroyed. So I think in our historical reading, a reading that pays no attention to the historical circumstances of these texts can be dangerous. One of the most important events in Jewish history was the destruction of the temple in the year 70 A.D. Up to that point, the temple, at least from the return from exile, had been the religious center and the cultural center of Jewish life in the Holy Land, but also for Jews who lived outside the Holy Land in the so-called diaspora. There was a fairly long period of tensions between some groups within Judaism and the Roman officials, but finally in the year 66 or so, there emerged a kind of full-scale rebellion. It was doomed from the start. But in the year 70, the Roman general Titus, taking over from his father Vespasian, who has been just named the emperor, destroyed the city and also destroyed the temple. So in the year 70 then, Jews were without their religious and cultural center. Moreover, the land of Israel itself was even more directly under Roman control. And this then meant that of the three great pillars of Judaism, the temple, the land, and the law, the only thing that remained was the law. So, how is Judaism to survive? There were several different approaches to the problem. One approach basically could be called the apocalyptic approach, the hope that God would be true to God's promises and intervene directly and vindicate Israel as his people and destroy the Roman occupiers. A second approach was a kind of revolutionary approach. This would be called the Zealots. That is, let's have another revolution. They did, in fact, in the year 132 to 135 under a leader who called himself Bar Kokhba, the son of the star. But that too ended in disaster. The two great candidates for the heritage of Israel then were the rabbis, or what we call formative Judaism, the ancestors of the rabbis, whose special interest was codifying and bringing together the traditions that had developed within Judaism, particularly around the interpretation of the law. Another group would be Jewish Christians, people like, I would say, Matthew and John, people who believe that the heritage of Israel is best carried on by the Christian movement, the Jewish Christian movement, in which Jesus was taken as the authoritative teacher. So I would see at least two of the Gospels, and I would see the other Gospels influenced to some extent by the same phenomenon of trying to give an answer to the question, where is Judaism now and where does it go? The early Christians were convinced that Jesus, in a sense, was the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel, and that he was the authoritative interpreter of the Old Testament law, and that, therefore, follow him, become his disciples. This, of course, resulted in a lot of tensions between the different claimants. For example, Matthew's Gospel speaks about their synagogues as if they were no longer his synagogue, as if they had been thrown out of the synagogue. Likewise, in St. John's Gospel, you get a phrase that appears 3 times, apos synagogus, outside the synagogue. This is a kind of threat that is posed to people who believe in Jesus. So I would see in the first century context, at least, several of the Gospels, if not all, responding to the fundamental crisis within Judaism, that is, where is Judaism now when we no longer have the temple and we no longer have the land? In a sense, Jesus is an obstacle to interreligious dialogue between Christianity and Judaism today. And in a sense, it's an insurmountable obstacle. These long ago have become two different religions. I think what we need to do, both Jews and Christians, is to understand that and respect one another and respect one another's distinctive beliefs. That having been said, I think by emphasizing the Jewishness of Jesus, by emphasizing the place of early Christianity within Judaism, I think we get a sense of being able to work together. In other words, as I said at the beginning, instead of over against, being with. And I think we come to realize that the images, the beliefs, the dogmas of Christianity are very much influenced by the language of the Bible, particularly the language of the Old Testament, but also the language of first century Judaism. And I think we can better appreciate our own distinctive Christian beliefs if we have some sense of where the language, where the images, where the conceptuality came from, and that is indeed Judaism. One of the striking features of Second Temple Judaism, by that I mean after the return from exile, up until the first and second centuries, is the influence of what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, how this became the language and this provided the store of images for both Judaism and Christianity. In a sense, both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaisms are new things. They're sort of twins that come from the same mother. That's one way to describe it. The mother is pre-AD 70 Judaism, with an active temple and with claim to the land. After 70, you had one kind of Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, that emphasized traditions and emphasized the importance of the Torah. On the other hand, you had another kind of Judaism, Christian Judaism, that emphasized Jesus as the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. So I think when we see the Jewish roots of Christology, where these titles came from and what their historical background is, we make at least an important contributions of being able to live together with one another better than perhaps we have in the past. However, there's no escaping the fact that beliefs about the person of Jesus arose very quickly within early Christianity. If you look, for example, at some of the early Christian hymns preserved in the New Testament, you're amazed at the extraordinary things that Jews, monotheists, are saying about the person of Jesus. I'm referring here especially to Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, in which Jesus is presented as the servant of God, rooted, of course, in 2nd Isaiah, but now he is described as the Lord, a title that is reserved for God. This is within 20 or 30 years after the death of Jesus. Likewise, in Paul's letter to the Colossians, Jesus is celebrated as the wisdom of God, first in the order of creation, as the wisdom figure is in the Old Testament, but also first in the order of redemption, the firstborn of the dead. A third example would be the beginning of St. John's Gospel, the famous in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Here, Jesus is being equated again with the wisdom of God, but what is being said is that Jesus is the revealer and the revelation of God. Now, these are all early Christian hymns. This is presumably what early Christians believed about the person of Jesus, and that they were kind of accepted, at least by a fairly large group of people. One distinguished scholar described this as not a development, but an explosion. So I think when all is said and done, you have to respect the distinctive claims made about Jesus very early on, but on the other hand also realize and appreciate the fact that many of these claims are cast in the language, imagery, and conceptuality of Second Temple Judaism. The expression supersessionism refers to a Christian theological tendency to imagine that once Christianity came, Judaism is now superseded and is no longer important. Jews missed the boat, as it were, and that we don't have to think about Judaism anymore. This has been a debate all through the centuries, back and forth. In some stages of history, it becomes a kind of entrenched position. In other stages, it gets questioned. It has been questioned, especially after the Second Vatican Council. And, in fact, in official Catholic statements, or at least statements made, for example, by Pope John Paul II, supersessionism has been theologically rejected. In other words, Israel is still a significant figure in the history of salvation, according to Christian theology. And this picks up what we find in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapters 9 through 11, where Paul is trying to put together three entities. He's got Christian Jews like himself. They're kind of the root of the olive tree. He has Gentile Christians who have been grafted onto the olive tree. And then he has Jews who are not Christians. Paul's hope is that in God's own good time and in God's own good way, all Israel will be saved. So Paul, in his mature thought, in Romans chapters 9 through 11, is certainly against supersessionism. Nostra Aetate, the document from the Second Vatican Council, pretty much paraphrases Paul in this respect. And again, does not engage in what could be called supersessionism. So I think while from time to time you find supersessionists, it is certainly not the teaching at the present time of the Catholic Church or the Catholic tradition. In this book, what I've tried to do basically is to place each of the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in their historical context as best one can do. There is a companion volume on St. John's Gospel by George Smiga, who does similar things. Then what I do is I take from each of the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, 15 passages that I think are particularly problematic or particularly important for emphasizing the relationship between Christians and Jews. Some that might be offensive to Jews, or at least in their plain reading, others that I think can help us to understand each other better. So I'm aiming particularly at teachers and preachers. This is not a technical book in the sense that you need a huge education in these matters to understand it. I'm drawing here on my own many years of preaching and teaching and trying to make things as clear as possible. But it's basically preachers and educators. Why that audience? Well, there was a famous study many, many years ago, probably 30 or 35 years ago, by Glock and Stock, two sociologists. And they investigated how do anti-Semitic ideas or anti-Jewish ideas get handed on in Christian circles. And it was basically teachers and preachers. In other words, whatever people come to know and think about or stereotype Jews comes oftentimes from what they hear in the pulpit or what they've heard in the classroom. And in fact, the statement from the Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate, insists that teachers and preachers have a special obligation to avoid anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in their preaching and teaching. So I intend this book, as I said, primarily for teachers and preachers today who might have to deal with these difficult texts oftentimes, or neuralgic texts or problematic texts, and trying to help them to understand these texts in the context of first century Judaism. With each of the 15 texts from the three Gospels, at the end I pose 3 or 4 questions, which I intend for discussion and reflection. It would be very interesting to see a kind of mixed group of Jews and Christians together, study these texts together and discuss the questions that arise out of these texts. In Jewish-Christian relations over the past 30 or 40 years, since the Second Vatican Council, the most successful experiments, if you will, have been when Jews and Christians come together and study their texts, in which Christians study Jewish texts along with Jews, and Jews study Christian texts along with Christians. That is a kind of concrete starting point that helps people to understand the other in a way that simply reading books cannot do. My ultimate hope for this book is that teachers and preachers will read it and be moved by it in the sense of rethinking certain ways of teaching or talking about New Testament texts that they may have used in the past. In other words, what I'm hoping for is a kind of sensitivity among teachers and preachers, especially Christian teachers and preachers. There is today also a fairly lively interest among Jews in the New Testament. On a scholarly level, there are many now specialists in New Testament studies who are practicing Jews, and they have contributed greatly to the study of the New Testament in the past 30 or 40 years. And there's a whole new generation of people of this sort. And I think even on the more parochial level of synagogues or Jewish studies programs and things of that nature, there is an interest in trying to understand New Testament texts and trying to see them as Jewish texts. There was a book that appeared about 30 or 40 years ago entitled in the German original, Bringing Jesus Home, and it was written by a German Jewish biblical scholar. And his point basically was to readopt, if you will, Jesus, to bring him back home into Judaism rather than simply leaving him out as a kind of an apostate or somebody who turned his back on Judaism, rather trying to understand him as a Jew and trying to understand Christianity as a movement, at least in its earliest days, within Judaism. It's an unusual role that the libraries have played in this book and anything else I've written. I have been associated with a periodical called New Testament Abstracts since 1963, and I've been the editor of it since 1972. That means I see every book and every article in the field, and in fact, I have to write summaries of what's in the book or what's in the article. And I love this work, by the way. It's been a wonderful thing. And for many years, I was with the Western Jesuit School of Theology. This has now become part of the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. And in fact, Western began as part of Boston College way back when. All of the books and all of the articles we do for New Testament abstracts go to the library. They go to the School of Theology and Ministry library now. So in a sense, I'm not waiting for the library to process the books. I'm sending the books over to the library. So I've seen all of these things, and it's been the most wonderful education imaginable. We do 2,100 summaries of articles and 800 summaries of books every year. And I see each and every one of these things and do a large percentage of them myself. We have articles in English, obviously, the predominant language of scholarship today, but German, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, Dutch, South African, God knows what. And so I get to see the whole world studying the New Testament. And I'm very interested in the journals we see and the books we get, and these have shaped me enormously. The result is, for the last 50 plus years, our library, now part of the School of Theology and Ministry, is one of the great New Testament libraries in the world, because we have everything. And again, this is a great research tool for myself. I know we have these things, and I can find them right away, but it's also a great research tool for graduate students, for scholars, and for anybody interested in the New Testament at a kind of higher level. So this is a great research library. I'm happy to have been part of it in developing it, and I'm thrilled to be able to use it.